Hello everyone, it's Seth, probably better known as Saffron Olive, and it's time for another daily dose of Innistrad Midnight Hunt spoilers. And even though it's a weekend, even a holiday weekend here in the US, we have some sweet stuff to talk about today. We got things that can double all of our creatures' power repeatedly, token producers, lords for werewolves, and pseudo-lords for zombies. There are some sweet stuff today, so we should probably jump right into it. Start talking sweet new Innistrad Midnight Hunt cards. Before we do, one quick reminder, if you want to keep up on all the latest spoilers, make sure to head over to MTGpreviews.com. We got them all over there. You can sort them, filter them, all that good stuff. So anyway, let's talk Innistrad Midnight Hunt. Need some new Innistrad Midnight Hunt cards? Well, you can pre-order them now from our sponsor, Card Kingdom, by heading over to cardkingdom.com. So first up today, we have a sweet green legend, Saryth the Viper's Fang. So 4 mana 3/4, legendary human warlock. Other tap creatures you control have death touch. Other untapped creatures you control have hexproof, and then you can pay 1 to untap another target creature or land you control. So Saryth, a pretty interesting card. We've never seen anything exactly like this before. We obviously have stuff that gives creatures death touch and gives it hexproof, but Saryth, it plays offense and defense in a pretty powerful way. So the best comparisons I could come up with, and they're not very good ones, is there's several cards like Bow and Nylea that give attacking creatures death touch, and while there's other ways to tap your creatures other than just attacking, most of the time that's how you're going to have your creatures tapped and how you're going to get death touch, and it makes it really tough for your opponent to block. Essentially, you play your Saryth, you swing with your team. If your opponent decides to block, you're going to be taking down whatever they block with, regardless of your creature's power and toughness, their creature's power and toughness. So very good on offense, but then the untap mode, also really good on defense. On defense, you just leave yourself untapped and it all has hexproof, so your opponent can't blow out your key blocker with a removal spell. Plus you can do some shenanigans by untapping a creature, which is kind of nice. Your opponent like targets one of your tap creatures with removal, you use Saryth to untap it, give a hexproof, fizzle the removal spell. So Saryth, it does some interesting things. I'm not exactly sure what to do with it in standard. Probably the most powerful thing you can do is creatures that can deal damage to other creatures, like mass death touch, can actually be incredibly powerful with things like walking ballista. Sure, you gotta attack with it to get it tapped, but then each counter you remove can just ping down any of your opponent's creatures. Or actual pingers like Prodigal Pyromancer are kind of hilarious because they have to tap to deal a damage. So once they're tapped, they're gonna have death touch, so that one damage they deal is gonna take down your opponent's Emrakul or Grizzlebrand or whatever massive creature they have in play. Or like Inferno Titan's damage, once it attacks, it's gonna be tapped, it's gonna spread that damage around, shoot down your opponent's board. So creatures that can damage other creatures directly, really powerful with Saryth. Unfortunately, there's not really anything like this in standard, or maybe fortunately, it might be pretty annoying if there are a bunch of pingers in standard to go along with Saryth. We do have Trample though, and that's the other way to take advantage of Death Touch. Death Touch and Trample interact in a really powerful way, because if your creature has Death Touch, it only needs to deal 1 damage to an opposing creature to kill it. So let's say you attack with Battle Mammoth, a 6/5 Trample with a Saryth out. Your opponent goes to block it with some massive creature. You're able to assign a single damage to that creature, and the rest goes face. So I could see some sort of mono green trample style deck, or 2-color trample style deck with Saryth developing in standard, where you're just playing jellies and gnarled professors and battle mammoths and using Saryth as a way to force through a ton of damage to your opponent's face. Also, the untap ability, used fairly, we talked about fizzling a removal spell, but I think really what's going to happen with this card most of the time is in Commander, it's untapping things like Gaia's Cradle or Nykthos, or in standard, untapping Circle of Dreams Druid with a big board. Kind of insane. Like, yeah, normally if you untap a land and that land just taps for 1 mana, it's not doing much of anything, but if you can untap lands or creatures that tap for a bunch of mana, it's kind of insane. You tap your Gaia's Cradle for like 8 mana, then you Saryth for 1, untap it, tap it for another 8. That's a ridiculous amount of mana. So I'm not sure exactly what you do with Saryth. This is one of those cards that I really like. It's a super cool design, but I'm not really sure where it sees play. It could fill the questing beast role control, but when you compare it to Questing Beasts, it is a lot less scary. It is nice, it has all this text on it, but it doesn't do as much right away unless you have a big board of other creatures to benefit from its abilities. So Saryth, I think it's a strong card. I just don't know what its home is. My best home so far is some sort of mono-green trample deck in Standard, or just weird shenanigans. The biggest problem with it in Commander that I found is most of the best shenanigans, like the Pinger thing or the Inferno Titan thing, they're in other colors. So if you play Saryth as your commander, you're not going to have access to them. On the other hand, if you play in the 99, are you going to draw it? So I think in Commander, it's mostly going to be like fringe upsides. You can build around the abilities a bit by protecting your creatures, by using tramplers, but really I think in Commander, it's that last ability that's going to be huge. Just untapping your permanents to tap for a lot of mana. That is insane on its own. So I like Saryth. I don't know what his home is, but it is a really neat design, and I'm excited to try to figure it out. Next up, we have the Celestus, and the Celestus, it's got a lot of words on it. Essentially, it's a 3-mana mana rock with a ridiculous amount of weird upsides. So when it enters a battlefield, if it's neither night nor day, it becomes day. You can tap it to add a mana, you can pay 3 and tap it, and if it's night, it becomes day. If it's day, it becomes night. Only do it as a sorcery. And then when day becomes night or night becomes day, you gain a life and you can loot. You can draw a card and discard a card. So on its base level, strip away all the other shenanigans, it's a 3-mana mana rock. It's a Darksteel Ingot. It's a Chromatic Lantern. Like, the floor on this is, I have a 3-mana artifact that taps to add an extra mana, and we've kind of seen 3-mana mana rocks fall out of favor a bit in Commander as players have focused more on 2-mana ramp, but I think that the Celestus might be able to break the mode just because it has so much upside. So first, it's a manolith that's also essentially like a Jalum Tome, where you're able to loot with it. 3 mana to turn day to night or night to day and loot and gain a life might not sound like much, but that actually is a big upside. One of the problems with mana rocks is while they're great in the early game, in the late game, they start to lose their value because you have so much mana, you don't really need 1 extra mana. So when you're playing this on turn 3 and getting to 5 mana on turn 4, that's amazing, but on turn 8, you're kind of like, I don't know. But being able to loot is a really nice upside to keep it relevant as the game goes along. More importantly, the Celestus doesn't care how night turns to day or day turns to night. Like, you can do it with the Celestus for 3 mana, but if you're playing other werewolf style cards, other day-night cards, then you could be looting with this very frequently without spending any extra mana. You got Arlens, and you got Tovalars, and you got Graveyard Trespassers, and Naturalists, and Brutal Cathars. There's a lot of cards that do this, and if you're playing other cards to switch back and forth from day to night and night to day, then that loot ability gets really crazy. You can potentially be looting multiple times each turn cycle in a game of Commander without spending any extra mana, and that is very powerful. Like, free looting and incidental life gain, that is kind of insane. So if you are playing werewolves, if you're playing some other day-night style deck, I think this is an auto include. Like, no doubt about it, in those decks, this is going to be the best mana rock in your deck, or one of the best mana rocks in your deck. So then you're playing it for sure, but even in just a generic Commander deck, I think it could be good, and I think maybe there's some chance that this could work in Standard. In Standard, 3-mana mana rocks don't normally see play, although again, the looting is a big upside. I could see a dedicated day-bound, night-bound deck wanting to take advantage of this, somewhat for the ramp, but mostly for the looting ability, to get rid of extra lands, to find the cards that you do need. So we'll have to see how it shakes out in Standard, but this is one of the more exciting mana rocks we've seen for Commander in a while, especially in day-bound, night-bound decks. But even in a generic deck, I'm at least going to try this card, because I think that upside of being able to turn day to night and night to day is really powerful. Plus, of course, if you're playing a werewolf style deck, then this becomes even better, because remember, not only are you turning day to night and looting, but you're getting to flip your Arlens and Tovalars and whatever other werewolf type things you're playing into their more powerful side at will for 3 mana. Like, 3 mana transform all of your werewolf stuff. That is kind of insane. So I think this card actually pretty exciting. It's going to be awesome in Commander decks, especially werewolf decks, and maybe a bit of a chance to see play in werewolf style Standard decks as well. We also got a new 1-drop vampire, Falkenrath League Fighter. So a 1-mana 2/1 vampire warrior. You can pay 1 and a red, discard a card, sack a vampire to draw 2 cards, but you can only do it if an opponent lost life this turn. So Falkenrath League Fighter, this card is really interesting to me for a couple of reasons. So for one thing, vampires have had a theme of madness for a while, going back to Shadows over Innistrad, and I kind of feel like this card could be a plant for Innistrad Crimson Vow, the second Innistrad set that's coming out in a couple of months. It might be that madness is the returning mechanic, or one of the returning mechanics, or something similar to madness, and that would make Falkenrath League Fighter really, really good. We already have cards like Falkenrath Gorger, which just gives all your vampires madness. Can you imagine being able to sack and discard to draw cards and be playing the vampires that you discard with madness? That seems kind of insane. Plus, you're getting a Savannah Lion's body. Like, that is a fine aggro creature on its own, so you already have a good on-curve 1-drop, and then you're essentially getting like a Tormenting Voice that you could use repeatedly. If you think about how Tormenting Voice works, you spend the Tormenting Voice itself and discard a card, so you're down 2 cards, but then you draw 2 cards. That is exactly what Falkenrath League Finisher does. You have to discard a card to sack a vampire, so you're down 2, but then you get back 2. That's a really powerful filtering ability that gets even better if you have like madness synergies or other shenanigans going on for those cards. And we've started to see the madness theme already work its way into Historic. Like, I'm fully convinced that these cards are a plant. I think we're going to get madness back. I could be wrong. I don't have any inside information. This is just speculation, but we just saw Jumpstart add a bunch of madness cards into the Historic format. We saw Modern Horizons 2 add new madness cards like Blazing Rootwalla into the modern format. Plus, vampires already have this theme, so I think we're getting madness back, and Falkenrath League Finisher is going to be a big piece of the puzzle in Standard and maybe in older formats as well. Like, maybe we can have Historic madness vampires with Asylum Visit, or even Modern or Pioneer. There's a ton of possibilities. And once you get back to Modern, you have all kinds of options. You got Bloodall Priest and Voldared Prize and Terminal Agony, and Falkenrath League Fighter seems like the perfect 1-drop for that deck. As far as Standard is concerned, the other important thing to mention about this card is it's a red Savannah Alliance. Like, if you're playing a red aggro deck, this is just fine. Like, even without madness synergies, even without tribal synergies, just as a Savannah Alliance with upside, like later in the game your opponent tries to kill it and you cast a burn spell and sack it and draw some cards, like, even that is really powerful. My only concern is the dominant form of mono red in Standard 2022, which is the closest thing we have to post-rotation Standard, is mono red goblins. Although there is a mono red aggro deck that's like tier 2, 2.5, somewhere in that range, and that deck's using Fireblade Charger and Hall Monitor as its 1-drops, and nothing against those cards, but they're 1-mana 1/1s. Falkenrath League Fighter, even without any madness support or other synergies, I think it's just a better red 1-drop. So I think this immediately shows up in red aggro decks, and then in a couple months you'll have even more potential once we get the vampire set. Plus, its second creature type is Warrior, and the red aggro decks are using things like Kargan Intimidator, which cares about warriors and has some shenanigans for warriors. So I think that Falkenrath League Fighter, this card's actually great. Immediately one of the best 1-drops for mono red aggro style decks in Standard. Madness synergies, vampire synergies, and potentially a plant for the future, and might make a lot more sense and be a lot more powerful once we get Innistrad Crimson Vow in a couple of months. So I think this is a really good card that you're definitely going to be seeing in Standard, and might even be seeing in other formats too. Next on our list, we have a sweet rare black werewolf, Graveyard Trespasser / Graveyard Glutton. So the Daybound side, a 3-mana 3/3 human werewolf. It has Ward of discard a card. So if your opponent wants to target it, they're gonna have to at least discard a card, which we've seen in Modern with Reality Smasher actually be a meaningful upside. It's not hexproof and my creature can never die, but it is a 2-for-1 if your opponent kills it, which is a big deal. Whenever it enters the battlefield or attacks, you exile up to 1 target card from a graveyard. If it's a creature, each opponent loses a life and you gain a life, and then the backside, you grow to a 4/4, the Nightbound side, and then when it enters the battlefield or attacks, exile up to 2 cards from graveyards, and for each creature exiled that way, each opponent loses a life and you gain a life. I actually think this card is really good. So it is worth mentioning, awkward colors for a werewolf deck. Werewolf's primary green-red. We've never had black vampires until Innistrad Midnight Hunt, so whether or not it fits in Werewolf Tribal, that we're gonna have to wait and see. However, This is just a good standalone card. The best comparison by far, upgraded Deathcourt Scavenger. And Deathcourt Scavenger, I know, it might not sound like much, but it was a played card in Standard, and it works very similarly. Enters the battlefield or attacks, exile a card from a graveyard. If it's a creature, you gain 2 life. If it's a non-creature, it gets +1/+1. Graveyard Trespasser, just an upgraded version of that. Another comparison would be like a replacement for Scavenging Ooze. Of course, Scavenging Ooze can sit out and just eat an entire graveyard if you got enough mana. Graveyard Trespasser, not going to do that, but still, it is incidental graveyard hate on an already decent body, like a 3/3 for 3 that could be a 4/4 for 3 if you get Nightbound and has some protection with Ward. That's a good creature on its own, and we're entering a Standard where I think graveyard hate going to be a little bit important. We got Flashback coming back. We have things like Consuming Blob. Like, one of the themes of every Innistrad set in the history of Magic has been graveyard shenanigans, so having this good creature that incidentally hates on the graveyard, a la Scavenging Ooze and Deathcourt Scavenger, is going to be a big deal. I think this will be a real threat in the format, and that doesn't even include all the graveyard stuff that's remaining in the format. Even Death. Blood on the Snow is on the rise in Standard 2022. We got things like Resplendent Marshal showing up in Angels, Quakebringer, and Giants, Narfi, Agadim's Awakening. I expect that many decks in our post-rotation Standard format are going to have some graveyard interaction, and Graveyard Trespasser gives you a good way to deal with it on a reasonable body that you don't mind playing anyway. Plus, it's another piece for the Daybound Nightbound deck, and like I said before, I don't know how it fits in Werewolves in specific just because of the color thing, but we've seen off-color werewolves now. We got like Brutal Cathar as a white werewolf, Graveyard Trespasser, but these cards I think are just good enough that you can play them on their own. Obviously, if you got a bunch of ways to flip it back and forth, get over to that Nightbound side quicker, it goes up even further in power. But even if you can't do that, like, I could imagine you just playing mono black aggro or something, and this just being my 3-drop because it's just a good card. So even if it doesn't fit in full-on Werewolf Tribal because of color considerations, it is still a good threat. It could even have a chance back to Historic. Historic's got a lot of graveyard stuff, Cauldron Familiars and Lurises and Faithless Lootings. So I think that Graveyard Trespasser, that's just a good card. Maybe it shows up in Werewolves. I don't know if it's actually good enough to show up in Werewolves because of the color issues. Are you going to want to splash into black in your Werewolf deck? We'll have to wait and see. But even if not, it's just a good 3-drop that looks like good 3-drops from the past that saw play in the past. So I would be absolutely shocked if Graveyard Trespasser was not, at a minimum, a really good sideboard card and possibly a really good main deck card. Like, cards like this are really, really powerful because they do 2 things in your sideboard. They give you graveyard hate and they give you life gain. So you can bring it in against graveyard decks, you can bring it in against aggro decks, mash that together, and Graveyard Trespasser / Graveyard Glutton is a kind of card you want in your deck in Standard. We also got Curse of Silence. Curse of Silence. When I first read this card, I was like, oh my god, that's so bad. But then I thought more about it, and I don't think it's bad. It's just not a firm hate card. So 1 mana or a curse, enchant a player. When it enters the battlefield, you choose a card name. Spells with the chosen name enchanted player casts cost 2 more to cast. And then, when enchanted player casts a spell with the name, you can sacrifice Curse of Silence if you do draw a card. So this is not a meddling mage. This is not a, I play this and you cannot play your thing for the rest of the game. But that's okay. It's only 1 mana. I think this is a tempo card, essentially. I think the idea of this is you're going to play this in White Weenie or some sort of White X aggro style deck. And while you're not going to be able to lock something out of the game forever like Nevermore Gideon's Intervention, this is just 1 mana so you can get it down early and easily, and you name a Wrath, you name Blood on the Snow, and you name Doomscar, something like that. And sure, eventually your opponent's still going to be able to cast a Wrath, but the idea is you're going to hopefully be able to kill your opponent before they get enough mana to cast that key card with the extra tax. Same with like Elrond's Epiphany, that's something else I could imagine naming. So while I don't think this is enough to play in the main deck, unless the meta ends up really skewed, I do think that this could end up being a sideboard all-star. I also like just how the card is designed. So it's soft hate, but it is pretty effective hate if you're in a deck that can be aggressive and take advantage of like that 2-turn window where it's going to slow your opponent's key card down. The other thing I really like about this card is just its design. The last mode where you can sacrifice it once your opponent casts the name card, that's actually a nice upside, because what happens is your opponent eventually, if things go wrong and you can't pull off that tempo win in the 2-turn window that you're slowing your opponent down, and they do resolve their Wrath or their Doomscar Star or their Alrund's Epiphany, your Curse of Silence is going to be useless anyway. Your opponent got enough mana that they're going to be able to cast their future copies of that spell, whether you have Curse or not, so it doesn't really do all that much anymore. So worst case, at least you get another card out of the deal to help you rebuild after the Wrath or whatever, and it plays well with a lot of the taxing effects we already have in Standard. Like, White Weenie in Standard is built around, like, Redain, an Elite Spellbinder, these other soft hate tax style spells. And while I don't think Curse of Silence is going to show up in the main deck like Spellbinder or just be like an All-Star or Redain, I do think it can play with this package where you're just making your opponent's key stuff cost more while you're also beating down with aggressive, evasive creatures. So I think that there is definitely a home for this card. I do think in older formats, it loses a lot of its luster. In older formats, where you can play a Meddling Mage or a Thalia or other harder forms of hate, the Nevermores and Gideon's Intervention, then I think this soft hate of Curse of Silence isn't as exciting, so I don't really expect this to show up in older formats. Maybe some small chance in like Historic Enchantress or something, but I like this card. It's soft hate, but it's cheap enough that being soft is fine, and when things go wrong and it doesn't work out, at least you cantrip it and get a card out of the deal, which makes it relatively powerful. We also got Croaking Counterpart, so a 3-mana Simic sorcery that lets you create a token of a copy of target non-frog creature, except it's a 1/1 green frog, and then you can flash it back for 5 mana. So this is a callback to Crackling Counterpart from original Innistrad, also a 3-mana copying effect with flashback. There are some big differences here. Crackling Counterpart only copies your stuff in its instant, and it gives you the full creature. You get their full power and toughness. Croaking Counterpart can hit any creature, but it's sorcery, and the creature is going to be a 1/1. You do get a cheaper flashback cost as well. I would say that Crackling Counterpart in most decks is probably better, just because you get the full stats of the creatures. It's a little annoying with Croaking Counterpart that you can copy like a 6/5 Battle Mammoth or something, and you're just going to get a 1/1 version of it, but that doesn't make Croaking Counterpart bad. I think the main use of Croaking Counterpart is going to be to copy creatures that either have Enter the Battlefield triggers or other abilities that are relevant without having stats. Like, you don't really care if your Lotus Cobra frog is a 1/1 because you're not playing Lotus Cobra to beat down. You're playing it to make a bunch of mana. Same with Skull Swarm. It's already a 1/1, or Skyclave Apparition. Sure, it's a 1/1 rather than a 2/2, but you're playing it for the removal or Callous Blood Mage's Enter the Battlefield trigger. So there are creatures where this can be very, very good, and the upside of hitting your opponent's creatures is pretty huge, just because one of the downsides of this effect is you cast it on your creature, your opponent removes it in response, and it fizzles everything, and you're down your creature. But if you're targeting your opponent's creature, much less likely to happen, because your opponent's not normally going to want to kill their own creature to fizzle your Crackling Counterpart. As far as Commander is concerned, I think that there are decks that'll want this. It makes a token copy, so it's perfect for like Adrix and Nev Twin Casters. I'm sure it's an easy upgrade for that deck. I would expect if you're getting 2 frogs for everything you copy, it's going to be actually kind of absurd. Same with like Riku. I imagine playing it in Yarok, where even though you're getting a 1/1 in these decks, you're not really trying to play big creatures. That's not the goal of the deck. You're trying to get synergistic wins and take advantage of your commander's powerful static abilities, and Croaking Counterpart seems perfect there as well. Also, if you want to get the Biovisionary win, Croaking Counterpart alongside Crackling Counterpart seems like a really good way to go about it. So I like this card. I don't think this is a competitive card. I would be shocked if we saw top tier Standard decks or Modern decks or whatever playing it, but it is a really fun card. It's a funny card with the frog theme, so I like it, and it fits my playstyle. I'm sure I will be playing this in Commander decks with my Yaraks and my Panharmonicons just grinding out value. So a really neat card and a cool callback to an older Innistrad card. We also got Unnatural Growth, a new enchantment. It is a lot of green mana, 4 green and 1, so 5 mana altogether, and at the beginning of each combat, double the power and toughness of each creature you control. So a lot of mana, a lot of green mana, but it can make your creatures really, really massive. A Statomonicon, I think someone called it. It can pour on a lot of damage. So we were talking earlier with Saryth about the possibility of some sort of green trample deck. Unnatural Growth seems well suited for that. Can you imagine getting this down in a deck with Orky Jellies and Gnarled Professors and Battle Mammoths? All of a sudden your Gnarled Professor is a 10/10. Your Battle Mammoth is hitting for 12, and with Death Touch it's basically just gonna kill people. So I could actually see some sort of mono green trample deck maybe being a legitimate thing in Standard. If Unnatural Growth sits on the battlefield and you got a big board full of creatures, it is gonna close out the game in short order, kind of like an overrun, although the big drawback is it doesn't give trample, so I do think you need to build around it. Just making a huge creature isn't that great because it can still get chump blocked by smaller creatures. The other thing to consider with this card is it says at the beginning of each combat. So I think this is meant to let you play defense with the card. Like, you leave some stuff untapped, go to your opponent's turn, your blockers get big so your opponent can't kill you, but it also synergizes with things that give you extra combat. So let's say you got a Morag out and you're going to take some extra combats, your creatures are going to double, and then when you go to extra combat, it's going to trigger again and you're going to double the doubling, and your creatures are just going to be unbelievably huge. And while I don't know if you can make the mana work of Unnatural Growth and Morag in Standard, in Commander there are some green-based decks that deal with extra combat steps. You got Najila, you got Grand Warlord Rada, you can make Xenagos into an extra combat step deck, because once you get into red, then you got a ton of ways to take extra combat, so I could see that working there as well. The quad green mana symbols, though, that is a concern. That's going to make it really difficult, especially in Standard, to splash this, although there are scenarios where it can be an upside. Maybe like Pioneer Mono Green Devotion. I don't know if they need this card, but it does have 4 green mana symbols for Nykthos. The deck makes a ridiculous amount of green mana, and it has a ton of big tramplers anyway. You already got Elder Gargaros, you got Voracious Hydras, and potentially one attack with an Unnatural Growth out is going to just one-shot your opponent. Also worth mentioning, not relevant for Commander, but if you ever have like 2 or 3 Unnatural Growths going, good lord, your stuff gets big, because you're going to double and then double again. So all of a sudden your Elder Gargaros hitting for like 24 damage or something with 2 Unnatural Growths, just one-shotting people. So a really sweet card. The mana cost does make me wonder how playable it'll be. It is going to be restricted. It's going to need something like that mono green trample style deck, because it's just going to be really, really difficult to play this in 2 color decks. 4 mana symbols in 1 color. That's a big restriction, but in mono green Commander decks, maybe you're playing Galta and just one-shotting people, or in mono green Standard decks, this card can be ridiculously powerful. We also got Sludge Monster. Sludge Monster, a 5 mana blue horror. You get a 5/5. When it enters the battlefield or attacks, you put a slime counter on up to 1 other creature, and non-horror creatures with slime counters on them lose all abilities and have base power and toughness of 2. So Sludge Monster, it's kind of tempo-y removal, essentially. I guess if you have a 1/1, you could technically try to grow it with Sludge Monster. And getting rid of all the abilities is an upside, although I see one big problem with the card, which is essentially you need Sludge Monster on the battlefield for the removal to work. The problem is, you play this, you make something into a slime or whatever, putting the counter on it, making it a 2/2, but then if your opponent kills the Sludge Monster, the creature still got a counter on it, but you don't have Sludge Monster's static ability, so the creature goes back to normal, which makes it really temporary removal. Could still work in Commander. It reminds me a little bit of like Anthin Mutineer, though Mutineer, remember, it has the upside of just exiling the creature. It gets rid of it forever, so even if Mutineer dies, you already did its job. Sludge Monster, it needs to stay on the battlefield to do its job, so I think this is more of a tempo card. That's how I see it, is you play this, get a blocker out of the way, try to get in a big attack, kill your opponent before they can kill your Sludge Monster. I think it'll be great in Limited, but I don't know. It seems like it has limited potential in Standard, and in Commander, it could be worth it, although, again, there's so much removal, so many Wraths in Commander, that I would prefer a permanent effect over one that works temporarily. And in Standard, you're also competing with, like, Imarith, which I just can't imagine Sludge Monster beating it out. So a cool card, maybe for Horror Tribal or something like that, but the fact that it's got to stay on the battlefield for its removal-esque ability to keep working, that is a pretty big drawback. In the world of reprints and lower rarity cards, we got some good ones. Pithing Needle making its return. Sorcerer's Spyglass, rotating. Pithing Needle, basically replacement. Upside, 1 mana cheaper. Downside, you don't get a peek at your opponent's hand, but mostly that's fine. It also has some incredibly disgusting art. Maybe the most disgusting Pithing Needle art so far. So a solid reprint, a nice catch-all, hits on Planeswalkers. Essentially, if you're using Sorcerer's Spyglass for something, you now have the option to use Pithing Needle. Also relevant for Historic. It's been a while since we've had Pithing Needle, so this is the first time we've had Pithing Needle in the Historic format, so a new entry there as well. We We also got some pretty powerful looking uncommons today. Bladestitcher Skaab, 2-mana pseudo lord for zombies, only gives +1/+0, but you do get a 2/3 for 2, which is reasonable stats, and I think this is going to be important because of decay. Decay zombies, which we get a lot of 2/2 decaying zombie tokens in this set. The problem is they can't block, so you can't use them on defense, and then they're only 2/2, so they're going to be hard to attack with. Having lords or a way to pump their power is going to make it a lot more practical to make a bunch of cheap decaying zombie tokens and be able to attack with them and get through your opponent's blockers or force your opponent to trade. So I think Bladestitcher Skaab at a minimum, if you're in the decay deck or zombie deck in limited, going to be really good, and I think it actually has an outside chance at constructed as well. 2/2 for 3, not bad stats, and even though it's not giving full +1/+1, +1/+0 is fine, especially with decay, because your stuff's going to die after it attacks anyway and it can't block, so there's really not much of a difference between +1/+0 and +1/+1 when it comes to decay creatures. We also got a pretty sweet 2-mana Werewolf Lord, Kessig Naturalists / Lord of the Uvenwald. So the day-bound side, a grizzly bears that when it attacks, you had a red or green that you keep until the end of turn through phases and steps. And the back side, the nightbound side, it's a 2-mana werewolf lord that still has that mana generating ability. Anytime you see a 2-mana lord, you gotta take notice of it. Those are the cards that make merfolk playable, slivers playable in older formats. Werewolves having a 2-mana lord, I think, is a pretty big deal. I think Wizards wants werewolves to be playable in standard. If they are, I think that Lord of the Uvenwald could certainly be a possibility, could certainly be a big part of it, especially if your deck is able to manipulate it and keep it on the nightbound side frequently, because that's way more powerful as a Lord than it is on the backside. We also got Devoted Grafkeeper, which isn't a Lord or anything, but it's a pretty interesting card. I really like this Disturb mechanic, where you're able to cast things from the graveyard transform. So the front side, a 2-mana 2/2 in the Azorius colors, when it comes into play, you mill 2 cards, and then when you cast a spell from your graveyard, you tap a creature you don't control. The backside, Departed Soulkeeper, that's a 3/1 flyer that can only block creatures with flying. This seems like a reasonable card to me. Like a 2-mana 2/1 that mills 2, if you have graveyard synergies, already okay. And then the backside, it's not a great card, but when you add that together in the inherent card advantage of this mechanic, like you play your Devoted Grafkeeper and you mill over Departed Soulkeeper, it's kind of like you drew an extra card essentially, because you can cast the Departed Soulkeeper from your graveyard. So I really like how this mechanic plays. Another card that at least is an all-star in limited, and if there's decks in the colors that care about the graveyard, I could see this being constructed playable as well. We also got Vampire Socialite, a pretty nice pseudo-lord for vampires. 2-mana 2/2 Vampire Noble. It has Menace. When it enters the battlefield, if an opponent lost life this turn, put a +1/+1 counter on each other vampire you control, and then as long as an opponent lost life this turn, each other vampire you control enters the battlefield with an additional +1/+1 counter on it. So there's a little awkwardness here that if you're making your opponent lose life, you probably already attack them, or else you have burn spells, I guess would be another way to support it. So this is kind of a post-combat main phase style card, which means you can't play this pre-combat main phase easily to pump your vampires and get in a big attack. But once this gets going, you're getting like a pseudo Rage Forger where it comes into play and puts a counter on everything. And then it works like a Metallic Mimic sitting on the battlefield. We'll see how easy it is to make your opponent lose life. That is the drawback. If you're not making your opponent lose life, it's just a 2/2 Menace, which isn't super exciting. But if you can consistently make your opponent lose life each turn, this card is a very powerful 2-drop option for a Vampire Tribal deck. We also got Faithful Mending, which is essentially a new Faithless Looting. 2-mana Azorius instant. You gain 2 life, you draw 2 cards, you discard 2 cards, flashback for 1 white and blue. So essentially, this is literally Faithless Looting, +1 mana, +1 color. However, you also get life gain, and you can do it at instant speed. So how good is Faithful Mending going to be? And I think the answer is pretty good. I don't think it's as good as Faithless Looting. The efficiency of Faithless Looting is absolutely huge, and that 1 extra mana, and especially the 2 extra colors, is a big, big deal. So I think that it's nowhere near Faithless Looting in terms of power, but that doesn't mean it's a bad card. I still think this card is incredibly playable. We've seen Faithless Looting mostly used in red decks with like Arclight Phoenix and Blazing Root Wallace, so Azorius is kind of like a weird color combination, but it might be that we see the decks with Faithless Looting Looting being mostly red because Faithless Looting is red, and it's so key to these archetypes. Having Faithful Mending might open up new possibilities. We got cards like Demolich, we have Snapcaster Mages, we got Torrential Gearhawks, we've seen Esper Unburial Rites style Reanimator decks, we've seen Gifts Ungiven style Reanimator decks in various formats. In those decks, being blue-white is actually a huge upside compared to Faithless Looting, and if you're playing a control shell, gaining 2 life is actually kind of huge. Like 2 when you cast it, 2 when you flash it back. That's a big deal in your control deck against aggro. So even though this isn't as efficient as Faithless Looting, I think it's going to be really good. Oh yeah, also 2 mana, untap your lands with Teferi, cast it at instant speed, more synergies there. So I think that Faithful Mending is probably a really good card. It's not Faithless Looting, it's not on that level, but I would not be the least bit surprised if this card was good enough to see play, not just in Standard, but in formats like Historic, Pioneer, and maybe even Modern as well. Like, that's how good this card is. Finally today, wrapping things up with a few more lower rarity cards, and these cards actually aren't that bad. Gravity Dawn Guard, 3 mana 3/3 with Ward 1. If it's neither night or day, it becomes day when it comes into play, and then when it switches from night to day or day to night, you have to look at the top 4 cards of your library, grab a creature with mana value 3 or less from among them, put it in your hand, the rest go on the bottom of your library. So if there is some sort of like white aggro daytime nighttime deck that develops, this could be a good source of card advantage. 3/3 for 3 with Ward 1, that's a reasonable body, especially for an uncommon. And then if you're flipping back and forth often in a deck that's mostly cheap creatures, this is a steady source of card advantage. Arcane Infusion, a way to dig into your top 4 cards to grab an instant or sorcery at instant speed. Seize the Storm can make a big token. Ghoulish Procession, almost a good card. 2 mana enchantment, when 1 or more non-token creatures die, make a 2/2 zombie creature token with decay. However, only trigger it once each turn. So not that this is bad, but only triggering once each turn really takes away the combo potential. There's no aristocrat shenanigans here, because you really need the repeatable token production to make that work, but it's still at 2 mana, kind of an interesting zombie decay generating enchantment. And anyway, I think that brings us to the end of our daily Innistrad Midnight Hunt spoilers for today. So what do you think? What are you most hyped for from today's spoilers? What are you thinking about this? I think the set looks absolutely spectacular. It's so much like old Innistrad, but then it's got a bunch of new stuff in it too. I am ridiculously hyped to see what comes next week when we get back to spoilers. So anyway, let me know what you're thinking. Let me know what you're liking. Thanks so much for watching. I hope you have an amazing holiday weekend, everyone. I'll be back, I think tomorrow, or worst case Monday, depending on how many I don't know how many spoilers we're getting over the weekend, but if we get enough spoilers, I'll be back tomorrow. Otherwise, I'll be back Monday with more daily Innistrad Midnight Hunt spoilers. So until then, everyone, have a great day, a spectacular weekend, and I will talk to you soon. Thanks for watching the video. If you enjoyed it, help us out by clicking that like button down below. And to keep up on all the latest and greatest, click that subscribe button. And don't forget to hit that bell icon to get alerts whenever we have new videos. And if you want to, check out some of our other sweet videos here and here.